I think everyone in America, and probably for many people across the world, are familiar with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly referred to as the Mormons. I mean, they're so committed to their door-to-door evangelism. Everyone has seen them walking in their neighborhoods. There's a couple well-dressed people with their name placards on, and they're coming door to door to share their faith. And they're some of the nicest people and most, you can see that there is a genuine commitment to their faith. Unfortunately, I've had them come over to my house, and I can see that they genuinely want me to join their faith. But unfortunately, there's some major problems that stand in the way between me as a Christian accepting their faith. And it's very interesting because Mormons, especially more and more, I feel like today, are very quick to describe themselves as Christians. If you go on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints websites, there's a section on there letting you know they are a Christian faith. But I think the difference between the LDS faith and the traditional historical form of Christianity comes down to the teachings of a guy named Joseph Smith. In the very beginning of the beginning of the faith, the beginning of Mormonism, a guy named Joseph Smith in the early 1800s appeared and said, he started going around and preaching that he was a prophet sent by God. And what Joseph Smith taught was that after the time of Jesus, many of the plain and precious truths, the things that Jesus really wanted you to know, have been lost by the apostles in the following generations, and that some of the key things of the Christian faith were no longer being taught on earth. And that now, 1800 years later, after Jesus' death, Joseph Smith has been sent by God to return all the lost teachings. And so it makes sense that if he's being sent by God to return these key teachings, that there would be key differences between Mormonism and Christianity, or at least the historical form of Christianity, the traditional form. And Joseph Smith, throughout his life, he translated what he said was book of ancient scripture, and then he gave new commandments from God, kind of like Moses gives commandments to the Israelites. Joseph Smith gave as many proclamations that he says are from God, and those are written down as scripture, and those are the key scriptures. So the people who belong to the LDS Church, they read the Bible, but they also hold to additional books of scripture, and those are the key distinguishing scriptures, the things that set them apart from the traditional form of Christianity. One of the big problems, though, is that there's a few teachings of Joseph Smith, of their theology, that really butt up against the strengths of traditional Christianity. For 1800 years before the time of Joseph Smith, Christians had developed a series of evidences for why Christianity was true. In the very early days, in the first couple hundred years after Jesus, you already see apologists, people who are writing extensively about the Christian faith and why you can accept it as true. They developed all that time many arguments for why Christianity was likely true. And some of these included what are considered the classical theistic proofs. These are evidences from philosophy, evidences from philosophy and science, other things we know about the world, that would suggest that a God like the God of the Bible exists and must exist. These arguments argue that a God must exist, and they must exist in the way that the Bible describes them. So two of them today, we're going to talk about. I'm not going to go into each argument. We have some other videos on the site. Feel free to look at them if you want to go a little more in depth. But one is the argument from creation, that since the universe appears to have begun in the distant past, that all time, space, and matter began, that there must be something which is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal in nature, God. There must be somebody like God who always existed and had decided to create the universe. And Christians will argue from the existence of moral laws, that because people have a moral obligation to one another, there's some things that are really good and really evil, that this suggests the existence of a person who transcends all other people, whose nature and will defines what is right and what is wrong, and that person who is above all things, transcendent above all people, is God. And he must exist, since moral laws do clearly exist. Some things really are right and really are wrong. Now, these are great strengths for the Christian. The Christian teachings in the Bible match what we can see from philosophical reason. And from science, we know from science that a Big Bang occurred in the distant past in which everything began. So from what we see from science and philosophy, those things are consistent with what we see from theology, from what the Bible teaches. But it's not consistent with Mormon theology or the theology of Joseph Smith. See, Joseph Smith made a couple key changes to Christian theology, and one of them is in the concept of God. Where Christians and Jews, or the believer, from the time of the Old Testament to the time of the New Testament, it's very clear that there's only one God, and that God, from that one God, all things came. But in Mormonism, God the Father, who they worship, they are not polytheists in terms of they worship more than one God. They only worship one God, God the Father, who is the creator of this world that we're on. But that God is not the only God which exists. But there are an essentially infinite number of other gods that exist. You see, in Mormonism, every person goes through a process of evolution isn't really the right word to say it, but they're like constantly growing from the point of a spirit child to throughout their life. And that some people mature to the point of attaining godhood, and that the God that created us, God the Father in Mormonism, went through this whole process, so that at one point God the Father was not a God, but was a lesser being, and he himself worshipped a God that created him. And the suggestion in Mormonism would be that God was also at one point not God and worshipped another God that created him, and that this went back essentially infinitely. There's two main problems with this. If there are an infinite amount of gods going back into the distant past, our God was created by a God who was created by a God, created by a God, then there is no real beginning of this sequence of events. There's no beginning of time for us to get to today. Well, we know from reason, and we've done some videos on this in the past. Please look at them for more details. But we know from philosophy that an infinite series cannot exist. We cannot cross an infinite series. So if there is an infinite amount of past events, we could never have gotten to the present time because we could never have crossed the distance. So the fact that we're in the present today shows that there is not an infinite series of events that have previously occurred. At some point, there must have been a beginning. So if Mormonism teaches that there is an infinite past, then there's a major philosophical problem. Reason alone would indicate that that is not true. If that we would say, okay, well, maybe there's many gods in Mormonism, but there eventually was a beginning. This causes an even a different problem, which would say that then at some point in Mormonism, if there was a beginning, then there was one God who is always God, and he created everything. All the series of events, all the gods that came after were created by that one supreme transcendent being. And then the question would be, well, then why are we not worshiping that thing? It would mean that Mormons were worshiping a lesser God, but ignoring, who had not always been God, but ignoring the transcendent God who is more powerful than all the others. This is a huge problem. It also causes problems for the moral argument, because the idea is that our moral laws all point back to one transcendent source, God. That's what the traditional Christian argument would be. There's one person that is above all others, and their will is reflected in the moral laws. Well, if the Mormon is getting their concept of morality from their God, well, it would seem to be somewhat arbitrary, because their God might be setting the rules for them, but that God was subject to another God's moral commands during its life, before God the Father attained godhood. And then that God also is subject to another God's will and another God's will. And so it would seem that each God is choosing potentially arbitrarily what is right and what is wrong, and that if we ignored our God the Father and we were looking at another God, would we be subject to a different moral law? So either in Mormonism, moral laws are arbitrary and just chosen willy-nilly by our God, who is just one of many, or they are objective, they are transcendent. But if they're transcendent, then they're given by a lawgiver who our God the Father is subject to. It would again basically point to the idea that at the beginning of the series of gods, there was one God who is always God, and that his commands, his nature was defined what was right and wrong, and that all other gods were subject to his nature, to his moral laws. So again, we would be focusing on a lesser God and ignoring the greater one. It's a major problem. I know that Mormons today would love to describe themselves as Christians. But the Christian philosophy, the robust classical theistic proofs that Christians for 2,000 years have been arguing for, do not apply to Mormonism. It is in a completely different category because of, I guess you can kind of see like how a small theological change, like a change in just one area, can have major impacts, major problems. When Joseph Smith moved Mormonism away from a monotheism, where there's just one God that always existed and is the ultimate transcendent being, when he moved them away into a theology which suggested there are many, if not an infinite amount of gods, he created major philosophical problems for his followers. To be a Christian, I'm supported. I can have confidence not only from my own faith, not only from my own experience of God, not only from my reading of the Bible, but I can have confidence in my faith because of what I know from other forms of information in the world, like science, like reason. But for me to, when the missionaries come over, they would love for me to leave my Christianity or my traditional form of Christianity and move to a faith in the LDS Church. But for me to do that, I would have to exclude what I know from philosophy, exclude what I know from science, and adopt a theology which I must truly take only on faith, because it is not just that it's not supported by philosophical reasons, but it is actually it spits in the face of these philosophical reasons. Unfortunately, to accept the theology of Mormonism would be to accept things that I know are not true from philosophy alone. I know there cannot have been an infinite series of events in the past. Yeah, I would have to accept that to join the LDS Church. And it's a major roadblock for me. I would love to think that the Mormon people in the LDS Church, I would love for them to see that they don't have to accept Joseph Smith's theology to find Jesus. The truth of Jesus is out there, and it is compatible with philosophy, with science, because it is the truth. It is actually true. Unfortunately, Joseph Smith added a bunch of baggage to Christianity that is going to distract from the truth of Jesus. I would just hope that those in the LDS Church can eventually see it.